The year was 1903. A small rural town lay quiet beneath a pale autumn sky. Wooden homes leaned against the wind, their roofs sagging under decades of storms. The dirt road that cut through the settlement carried more silence than voices, more dust than footsteps. It was a town easy to forget, a place lost in time. But within its schoolhouse, a moment was captured, one that should never have existed. That year, the children were called together for a class photograph. It was a ritual of pride for the families, a record of learning and order in a world where both were fragile. The schoolhouse itself was small, creaking wooden boards, chalk dust in the air, and the faint smell of oil lamps clinging to the walls. Outside, the trees bent in the late-season wind, whispering like restless spirits. Inside, the children were arranged in neat rows. Girls in starched dresses, hair tied with ribbons that had already frayed. Boys in patched jackets, shoes scuffed from long walks through the fields. Their faces were solemn, not because they wished to appear serious, but because the camera demanded it. In 1903, a photograph was not a fleeting moment. It was a performance of stillness, a bargain with time itself. The photographer adjusted his tripod. The teacher gave stern reminders to hold still. A hush fell across the room. The lens opened. The air froze. And in that instant, 24 faces were caught in the eternal stare of the photograph. It was ordinary. It was expected. Until, decades later, it was not. The photograph resurfaced nearly half a century later, found in a dust-choked attic as the belongings of an old family were sorted. Its edges had yellowed, the ink fading, but the image was intact. At first glance, it seemed like any other relic of the era, an unsettling reminder of children whose names had long since been forgotten. Old photos often carry this eerie weight, their eyes fixed, their smiles absent. But one detail shattered the comfort of nostalgia. There was an extra child. Look closely. The rows are neat. The teacher is at the center, arms folded. 23 children sit in careful alignment, each one known to the community. But then, at the far edge, almost blending into the shadows, sits a pale-faced figure. Small, thin, unsmiling. A child no one recognized. Every family in town had sent their children to the schoolhouse that year. Records had been kept, names written carefully in the attendance book. Yet when the photograph was compared to those records, the count did not match. 23 were listed. 23 were remembered. But the photo showed 24. Who was the forgotten child? Dark history is riddled with unsolved mysteries, strange families, and disturbing images. This was not the first time a relic had raised more questions than answers. But this photograph carried something heavier. It suggested a presence that should not have been there. Some whispered of vanished children, others of haunted places. The photo became more than a curiosity. It became a wound in the town's memory. The eerie details grew more disturbing with every glance. The strange child's clothes did not match the others. The fabric looked older, outdated, as though it belonged to another decade. While every child cast a faint shadow against the wall, this one seemed less defined, blurred, almost transparent. Some believed it was a trick of exposure, the result of primitive cameras. But others who examined the print claimed the figure was too distinct to be an error. Its face, though pale and hollow-eyed, stared directly at the camera, as if aware of being seen. The families of the town denied knowledge of the child. No one claimed them. No one remembered a seat left empty, or a name unspoken. In the records of 1903, the child simply did not exist. And yet, in the photograph, they remained. The unsettling history of this time offers chilling possibilities. Death was a constant companion, and grief often manifested in disturbing ways. Post-mortem photography was still practiced in small towns, where mourning families posed their deceased children among the living as a final act of remembrance. Could the strange child have been such a figure, placed quietly into the portrait, then forgotten? But if that were true, who placed them there? And why was no death recorded, no family ever associated with the child? Even the oldest residents, those who had lived through 1903, claimed no knowledge of an extra pupil. Their denial only deepened the mystery. Some whispered darker theories. A hidden tragedy. A child erased deliberately, perhaps for reasons too sinister to be written down. Forbidden language was sometimes used to describe those deemed cursed, unwanted, or inhuman. Could this child have been part of such a cruel story? Hidden truth has a way of festering in forgotten towns. Others, more superstitious, believed the child was not of this world, that the photograph had captured a wandering spirit, one who lingered near the schoolhouse, drawn to the presence of the living. Old stories spoke of vanished children who never returned home, their voices echoing faintly in the empty hallways long after dark. Some swore the class photo had trapped one of them, freezing their presence for eternity. The more one stared at the photograph, the worse it became. It was not merely the face of the child, but the expression. Blank, cold, as if the figure knew something the others did not. A hidden truth, sealed into the image like a curse. This was more than just a forgotten class photo. It was a message from the sinister past, a reminder that unsettling history has ways of clinging to us, through eerie details and chilling secrets that refuse to fade. One photograph, one missing identity, one face that does not belong. And this was only the beginning. The year was still 1903. The photograph may have been taken inside a single classroom, but to truly understand its haunting weight, you must first understand the town that surrounded it. Because this was no ordinary place. It was a settlement on the edge of obscurity, a town already halfway forgotten, even while it still lived. The town was small, little more than a cluster of homes built from rotting timber and patched shingles. Its streets were dirt, turning to rivers of mud in the rain. Smoke drifted endlessly from chimneys, curling above rooftops like ghosts reluctant to leave. By day, the place looked weary. By night, it became something else entirely, silent, watchful, as if holding its breath. Families here lived hard lives. Children rose with the dawn, not for play, but for chores. They carried buckets of water, split wood, tended animals before their feet ever touched the classroom floor. Hunger was familiar. Illness was common. In the dark history of such towns, children often vanished, taken by disease, accident, or despair. Many graves were dug before their time. At the heart of it all stood the schoolhouse. A single-room building, built of rough-hewn boards and leaning slightly with age. It was both a place of learning and a cage of discipline. Inside, the walls were scarred by decades of chalk marks, the air thick with coal smoke from the iron stove. The teacher, often strict to the point of cruelty, held authority over every child in town. To disobey was to invite shame, or worse. But the school was also where the town's secrets gathered. Children spoke of things they should not have known. Haunted places in the woods, families who spoke in forbidden language, stories of chilling secrets whispered from parent to child. The schoolyard itself carried its own mysteries. Footsteps were heard in the dirt after class had ended. Strange laughter echoed when the yard was empty. Some said the building never truly slept. The class photograph was meant to preserve innocence, yet innocence was rare here. Families were haunted by debts, hunger, and grief. There were tales of strange families who appeared suddenly, then disappeared just as quickly, leaving no trace behind. Children spoke of classmates who were present one week, gone the next, never mentioned again. And still, no one asked questions. Silence was survival. It was in this climate of unease that the photograph was taken. 23 children, known, documented, remembered. And one child unclaimed. A face that carried no name. A presence that belonged to no family. When descendants decades later studied the image, they tried to connect the nameless figure to the school's history. They combed through rosters, birth registries, grave markers. They traced every family tree. Each led to the same conclusion. There had never been 24. Only 23. But the town itself was not so easily trusted. Records from these places were often incomplete, filled with gaps and erasures. Some names were spelled wrong. Some were missing entirely. Children who died young were sometimes never recorded at all, their existence fading like smoke. In the unsettling history of forgotten towns, lives could disappear without a trace. And yet there was something different about this case. For while memory can fade and records can vanish, the photograph remained. Its disturbing image refused to be erased. It stared back, demanding recognition. The child in the photograph was not imagined, not mistaken. The face was there, printed in silver nitrate, as real as any other. Look closely at the image, and you will see what many noticed. The known children sit stiff, their gazes locked forward. But the strange child sits at the edge, apart, almost retreating into shadow. Their features are sharp but faint, their posture uneasy. It is as if the figure existed in two worlds at once, half in the classroom, half somewhere else. And this unsettled the town in ways few dared admit. Old photographs already carried unease. They were windows to a time of loss, of vanished children, of hidden truth. But this one? This one whispered something darker, something forbidden. Some families suggested quietly that the child belonged to no home in town, that perhaps they had wandered in from the woods, where strange families once lived beyond the reach of law. Others whispered of epidemics, scarlet fever, cholera, that had taken so many young lives. Was the figure in the photograph a ghost of one such tragedy, captured forever by accident? Theories spread, but none brought comfort. Because the schoolhouse remained, abandoned now, its boards warped, its roof collapsing. Yet even in ruin, locals claimed it felt alive. Children who explored its empty halls spoke of whispers in the corners, shadows that shifted when no one moved. Some said the place was haunted not by one ghost, but by many. And the class photograph was proof. One town, one school, one forgotten face. The question still lingers, echoing across a century. Was the extra child a victim of the town's sinister past, or something that never truly lived at all? The year was still 1903. The morning of the photograph began like any other. The children trudged through muddy streets, their breath misting in the cool autumn air. Some clutched books wrapped in cloth. Others carried nothing at all, their bare hands already red from the cold. The town stirred slowly, horses snorting against the frost, women drawing water from frozen wells. Life was harsh, but steady. And yet, something about this day would not remain steady at all. Inside the one-room schoolhouse, the teacher had prepared the class for the arrival of the photographer. It was an event both rare and important. Cameras were not common here. To summon one was to summon memory itself, to trap time in silver and glass. For families who owned nothing but worn clothes and simple tools, a photograph was priceless. It promised that their children's faces would not be lost in time. The photographer, a traveling man with a case of equipment heavier than he was, set up his tripod carefully. The wooden legs sank into the uneven floorboards. He unfolded the bellows of the camera, polished the lens with a rag, and tested the light. Outside, pale sunshine drifted through the dusty window panes, turning the air into a haze of chalk and smoke. The children were arranged in rows. The taller ones at the back, smaller ones in the front, the teacher standing proudly in the center. There was no laughter, no playful chatter. The command was clear: sit still, hold your pose. Let the camera see you. Look closely at this moment. Imagine the stiff clothing, the heavy silence, the photographer's sharp command: do not move. The teacher folded her arms. The children stared ahead, their faces already taking on that eerie stillness old photos always reveal, somewhere between life and death. And then, the lens opened. For the briefest instant, the room became eternal. Shadows froze. Eyes locked forward. The light of 1903 burned into the glass plate. And just like that, the moment was trapped forever. When the photograph developed, the image seemed ordinary at first. Rows of children, a teacher, a classroom too cramped for comfort. But then came the unsettling detail, one that should never have been there. At the far edge of the frame, seated slightly apart from the rest, was a child who had not been seen entering that day. A face pale, thin, and out of place. The disturbing image held 24 figures. Yet the roll book recorded only 23. The teacher, proud of her class, could name each child, except this one. Some later argued that the child must have slipped in unnoticed. But how? The room was too small, the supervision too strict. Others whispered that the photographer's lens had revealed what the human eye could not. Old photos are known for their eerie details, for capturing things unseen in the moment. A hand without a body. A blurred face staring where no one should be. Some dismissed it as error, but others felt the truth was darker, that the camera had caught something it should not have. Look again at the photograph. The strange child's clothing appears old, outdated even for 1903. Their posture stiff, unnatural. Their gaze hollow, eyes locked in a way that unsettled even the bravest who studied it. While every other child cast a faint shadow in the afternoon light, this figure seemed blurred, almost translucent. Decades later, descendants who studied the image found no record of the child in school registers, church books, or family histories. No graves bore their name. No one remembered their laughter, their voice, or their disappearance. It was as if the photograph had birthed them and trapped them at the same time. The horror storytelling surrounding this event grew darker over the years. Some claimed the child was a ghost, the restless spirit of someone who had died in the town's sinister past. Others suggested it was an act of post-mortem photography, an attempt by grieving parents to insert their dead child into one last memory, even if it meant deception. But if that were true, who were the parents? Why did no one speak of them? The mystery deepened further when the photograph itself began to disturb those who viewed it. Some swore that the pale child's face shifted slightly when looked at too long, that its eyes seemed to follow, that its expression carried a chilling secret no words could explain. And so the photograph, intended as a proud relic of education and innocence, became something else entirely. It became a haunting, a visual reminder that history is never truly safe, that hidden truth sometimes bleeds through, leaving behind sinister artifacts for us to uncover. This was not just a school photo. It was a doorway, and through that doorway stared a child no one remembered. It was decades later when the photograph resurfaced. The year was no longer 1903. The children who once sat in that room had grown old, or passed on entirely. The schoolhouse itself had fallen into ruin, its roof sagging, windows broken, the chalkboard covered in the dust of half a century. The world outside had moved forward. Automobiles now roared down paved roads. Cities stretched upward. But in a forgotten attic, inside a decaying wooden chest, the class photo waited, patient, silent, and unchanged. It was found during the sorting of an estate, after the last surviving member of a local family had died. Relatives, eager to divide belongings, began pulling items from the attic. Quilts moth-eaten to lace, books swollen with damp, toys carved from wood, their paint long since faded. And then, beneath it all, an envelope stiff with age. Inside, a single photograph. At first glance, it looked ordinary. Just another relic of a forgotten time. The family glanced at the rigid faces, the stiff postures, the familiar eeriness of old photos. The teacher stood tall, the children sat in rows. It was no more unusual than any other image from dark history, those unsettling group portraits where life already looked too close to death. But then someone counted. 23 children should have been in that photo. 23 were recorded in the school ledgers, yet the image revealed 24. An extra face, pale and blurred, seated apart from the rest. A child no one could name. The unease began slowly, like a draft in a closed room. At first it was disbelief. Surely this was just poor memory, a miscount, a forgotten cousin or visiting child. But when older locals were shown the disturbing image, the reactions turned cold. They recognized every child in the photograph. They could name them, family by family, row by row. Except one. The strange figure was not recognized by anyone. No family claimed them. No stories recalled them. No graves bore their name. That was when curiosity became fear. Researchers began their search. The census records of 1903 were checked. Church registries of baptisms, marriages, and deaths were examined. Family Bibles were opened, their fragile pages traced with trembling fingers. Every name was accounted for, except one. The extra child had no history, no evidence of life, no evidence of death, nothing but the photograph. And so the photograph grew heavier. It was no longer a keepsake. It was an unsolved mystery, a fragment of unsettling history that whispered of hidden truth and chilling secrets buried beneath silence. Look closely at the image, and the details become more sinister. The pale child's clothing seemed older than the others, as though from a previous decade. The face was faint, blurred at the edges, as if the figure were fading even as the camera captured it. Most disturbing of all, while every other child sat rigid, eyes locked forward, this one seemed wrong. The gaze direct, the posture unnatural, the expression unreadable. Some who studied the photograph reported strange feelings. The room would feel colder. Shadows seemed deeper. One woman swore the pale child's eyes followed her wherever she moved. Another claimed she dreamed of the figure for nights afterward, standing in the corner of her room, silent and waiting. Stories began to spread. Some said the child was a ghost, captured by accident, forever trapped in silver nitrate. Others whispered of strange families on the edge of town, those who spoke in forbidden language, keeping to themselves, hiding their children. Could this child have belonged to one of them? Could their disappearance have been deliberate, a piece of dark history erased by design? But then came the most disturbing suggestion of all, that the figure was never alive to begin with, that what the photograph had captured was not flesh and bone, but something else, something that wore the face of a child but did not belong to this world. Theories clashed. Arguments grew. But no answer brought peace. The more people looked at the photograph, the more it seemed to resist explanation, as though the truth itself had been hidden, buried under decades of silence, erased by those who had lived it, only to rise again in the form of this unsettling image. The uneasy discovery became a story the town could not forget, a reminder that even the most ordinary artifacts, an old class photo, a dusty attic, a forgotten envelope, can carry chilling secrets. And sometimes, those secrets refuse to stay buried. One photograph, one extra child, one haunting that would never be explained. And the deeper people searched for answers, the darker the questions became. The photograph should have been forgotten. It should have been tucked back into the envelope, sealed in a drawer, and left to gather dust. But that is not what happened. Once the image was seen, once the extra child was counted, there was no way to unsee it. The whispers began. At first, they were cautious. A question spoken over tea, a murmur exchanged at the general store. Who was the 24th child? They asked. Where did they come from? Where did they go? And soon the town, small and weary as it was, became a breeding ground for rumor. The older families claimed to remember strange things. A girl who walked the edges of the schoolyard, but never came inside. A boy seen peering from the woods, silent and pale, watching the other children at play. Parents would hush their children when the subject was raised, as though speaking of it might invite something into their homes. Look closely at the timeline of events. By 1903, the school had been operating for 2 decades. Dozens of children had passed through its doors. Yet no record, no ledger, no census, no grave marker spoke of this extra child. That silence was its own kind of answer. Something had been erased, or worse, something had never belonged. Rumors grew darker. Some said the figure in the photograph was the spirit of a child buried beneath the schoolhouse itself, a casualty of a fever epidemic never written in official accounts. Others whispered of families who spoke in a forbidden language, their origins unknown, keeping to themselves on the outskirts of town. These were the strange families, the ones accused of hiding disturbing secrets, the ones blamed when livestock died mysteriously or when crops failed. Could the forgotten child have been one of theirs? But there were more sinister stories still. Some claimed the pale figure was no child at all. that the thing which appeared in the photograph had been seen before, standing at the end of beds, hovering at the edge of candlelight, appearing in doorways during sleepless nights. An entity, not a person. Something that borrowed the form of a child, not to belong, but to deceive. By the 1920s, the story of the extra child was no longer just a curiosity. It was a legend. Children dared each other to sneak into the abandoned schoolhouse, whispering that if they sat in the front row of the decaying classroom, they might hear an unfamiliar voice whisper their name. Others swore they saw the faint shape of a boy or girl standing in the shattered window at dusk. The disturbing image itself circulated quietly, passed between families, tucked inside local archives, shown to outsiders only in hushed tones. Those who studied it closely reported unsettling details that seemed to change. One librarian claimed that over the years, the pale child's face grew sharper, clearer, while the others faded with time. A farmer insisted the eyes, once blurred, now stared directly outward, as though the figure was watching whoever dared to look. Unsettling history has a way of bleeding into folklore. And folklore has a way of keeping fear alive. By the mid-20th century, the forgotten photograph had taken on a life of its own. It was no longer just about the extra child. It was about the idea that the town itself carried a stain, a hidden truth it could not wash away. When the photograph was finally displayed at a small local exhibition in the 1950s, the effect was immediate. Visitors reported feeling uneasy, unable to look at the image for more than a few seconds. Some walked away pale, unsettled. Others whispered that the child seemed to move in the frame, shifting subtly when no one was watching. The whispers grew. The forgotten child was no longer just a mystery. It was a presence, an unseen guest that clung to the town's memory, always just out of reach, never explained. And those whispers soon evolved into something far more chilling. For some claimed that the photograph wasn't the only record, that scattered in other homes, hidden inside other forgotten albums, the same face could be found, appearing where it shouldn't, sitting with families it did not belong to, haunting moments it was never meant to witness. One forgotten child. One sinister past. One shadow that refused to be erased. And the deeper people looked, the more they began to fear that the photograph was not simply preserving a moment of history. It was preserving something else. Something that wanted to be remembered. The whispers would not stop. The disturbing photograph refused to rest. And so the inevitable question came: who was the forgotten child? In the years that followed its discovery, local historians, genealogists, and curious strangers began the search. They combed through the archives with the desperation of those chasing a ghost. Each believed they might be the one to give this child a name, to restore a lost fragment of unsettling history. But the deeper they looked, the more disturbing the mystery became. The school records were the first to be examined. In 1903, the ledger was carefully kept. Names written in ink, neat columns of attendance, punishments, and grades. Every child accounted for. Every child known. But the records told a truth that clashed with the photograph. Only 23 names appeared, yet 24 faces stared back from the image. Researchers turned next to the census. Families were traced line by line. Fathers listed as farmers, miners, carpenters. Mothers as housewives. Children as sons and daughters, their ages marked beside them. Not one entry suggested a missing figure. Not one revealed a hidden child. The census was silent. Too silent. But silence, in dark history, is rarely innocent. Digging deeper, strange details began to surface. Entire families seemed to vanish between one decade and the next. Households that appeared in 1900 were gone by 1910, their names erased as though they had never existed. When asked, elders muttered vague explanations: illness, relocation, bad harvests. But their answers carried unease, as though speaking the truth would summon something unwelcome. The church records revealed more contradictions. Baptisms that were never followed by burials. Deaths noted without births to precede them. A forbidden language scrawled in the margins of one parish book, as if someone had written words not meant to be read aloud. Even the priest's handwriting trembled on those pages, his ink blotched, as though he too had been afraid of what he was recording. And yet nowhere did the forgotten child appear. No baptism, no marriage, no death, no grave. The disturbing image haunted every attempt at explanation. Could it have been a trick of light? A chemical imperfection on the plate? Perhaps. But why then did the figure seem so deliberate, so intentional? Why did it sit so perfectly among the others, a presence impossible to dismiss? Theories grew more desperate. Some whispered of post-mortem photography, the Victorian practice of capturing the dead alongside the living, posed to look alive one last time. Was this child such a figure, an echo of a body already buried, placed among the living for a final farewell? Yet no family admitted to such a ritual. No coffin was remembered. No burial ground opened. Others began to suspect darker truths. Was the child a victim of a family scandal, hidden away, denied recognition, yet captured by accident when the camera was brought to school? Or perhaps something far worse? Whispers told of children who vanished in that era, never found, swallowed by woods or by rivers. Could this extra figure be one of them, making itself known only through the lens, demanding not to be forgotten? Researchers grew obsessed. Old letters were read. Diaries were uncovered. One journal, belonging to a teacher of the era, described unsettling presences in the schoolhouse. She wrote of shadows at the windows, of the sound of laughter echoing when no children were near. One entry in particular chilled those who found it. There is always one more child than I can name. I count 23, but I feel 24. Still, no name. No proof. Only fragments of fear, scattered through the archives like broken glass. By the 1970s, the search had expanded far beyond the town. Paranormal investigators arrived, convinced the photograph was evidence of haunting. They brought tape recorders, electromagnetic devices, and cameras of their own. In the abandoned schoolhouse they captured whispers, indistinct, hushed, but chilling. One recording contained a single word, remember. But remember who? The question remained, gnawing at everyone who studied the case. The photograph was not just an image, it was a trap. It demanded answers, but it offered none. And the harder one looked, the more the identity of the child dissolved like smoke. Some said the absence of a name was the point, that the figure in the photograph had never been human at all, that it had always been a shadow, a presence, something lost in time yet desperate to intrude on memory, that what the camera captured was not a forgotten child, but something far darker. The search for the child's identity revealed only one thing with certainty. The past does not give up its secrets willingly, and sometimes what is hidden is not meant to be found. One name missing, one child unclaimed, one truth buried deeper than any grave. And still the photograph waits. Behind every building, there is a shadow. Behind every history, there is something unspoken. And behind the little wooden schoolhouse of 1903, there was a darkness no one wanted to acknowledge. At first glance, the school seemed ordinary. One room, a bell tower leaning slightly in the wind, rows of desks worn smooth by restless hands, chalk dust lingering in the air. But look closer, and unsettling details emerge. Stories whispered by children. Strange marks carved into the wood. Echoes in the hall that did not belong. Behind the school stretched a patch of land overgrown with weeds. Long grass swayed like a restless sea. Stones, some toppled, some hidden, jutted out of the soil. The elders insisted it was once a burial ground, though no official record admitted it. Children said bones still slept beneath the earth, unnamed and forgotten. The location itself was peculiar. The school had not been built in the center of town, as most were. Instead, it stood on the edge, at the border between farmland and forest. The trees pressed close, their branches bending inward like watching arms. At dusk, the woods grew unnaturally still. Birds did not sing there. Even the wind seemed hesitant to enter. It was in these woods, behind the school, that children claimed to see the pale figure long before the photograph was ever taken. A child standing just inside the tree line, motionless, watching, never speaking. Teachers dismissed the tales as overactive imagination. But fear spread among the students, and soon, no one lingered after lessons ended. Old diaries recovered from the era added to the unease. One teacher wrote of hearing whispers behind the schoolhouse when she stayed late to grade papers. Another described footsteps pacing outside, even when the yard was empty. And then there was the entry too disturbing to ignore. The children avoid the back windows. They say something stands in the tall grass, staring. I cannot bring myself to look. Local folklore tied the land to darker legends. Some whispered it had once been a meeting ground for those who practiced forbidden language, rituals spoken in words not meant for human tongues. Others claimed the area was cursed, a place where strange families had buried their unwanted children in secret graves. There were even stories of post-mortem photographs taken in the woods, grieving families posing the dead as though they were alive, shadows forever clinging to the negatives. The connection between the photograph and the land became harder to ignore. Was the forgotten child in the picture one of those buried behind the school? A restless spirit, demanding to be seen? Or had the land itself, soaked in sorrow and secrecy, created an echo, a figure of its own making, captured by the camera in a moment when the veil thinned? By the 1940s, when locals passed the crumbling schoolhouse, they often crossed to the other side of the road. Too many claimed to feel watched when they neared the building. Too many swore they heard faint laughter drifting from behind the walls, though the classrooms had been empty for decades. One account from a traveling preacher was particularly unsettling. He claimed that when he approached the back of the building, the air grew thick, heavy, impossible to breathe. He dropped to his knees, clutching his chest, before stumbling away in terror. Later, he told townsfolk, there's something that should not be remembered. And yet, despite the fear, the photograph remained. The disturbing image continued to circulate, always pulling people back to the same question. Who was the child? Was the answer hidden not in the school records, but in the ground behind it? Modern researchers who visited the site described an atmosphere that defied explanation. Photographs taken of the ruins often developed with flaws, faces blurred, shadows too dark, eerie details that seemed unnatural. Some reported seeing an extra figure in their images, standing in the grass just beyond the schoolhouse walls, always faint, always watching. The darkness behind the school was more than a place. It was a presence. It was the shadow that clung to the photograph, the silence that haunted the records, the unease that lingered in every retelling of the story. Perhaps the forgotten child did not belong to the school at all. Perhaps the figure belonged to the land itself, the land that had seen too much, buried too many, and refused to remain silent. One building, one patch of ground, one presence that would not be erased. And the deeper the story went, the more it became clear. The forgotten class photo was never just about the children who lived. It was about the shadow of the one who didn't. Time passed, yet the photograph refused to fade. It became more than just an image. It became an obsession, a piece of unsettling history that demanded to be revisited again and again. Each generation brought new eyes, new theories, and new fears. And with every re-examination, the photograph revealed details no one had noticed before. At first glance, it still looked ordinary. A simple class portrait, stiff and colorless. The children in rows. The teacher behind them. Shadows in the background, nothing more than tricks of light. But the longer one stared, the more the disturbing image seemed to shift. The pale child, once dismissed as a blur, grew sharper. The features clearer. The presence undeniable. Historians looked for flaws in the glass plate process, but the chemistry held no answers. The ghostly figure was not the product of double exposure. The positioning was too precise. The lines too deliberate. Others claimed it was damage from age, a chemical stain. But why then did the stain resemble a child so perfectly? Why did the eyes seem to follow every viewer who dared to meet them? By the mid-20th century, magnifying tools had become more advanced. Enlarged prints revealed chilling secrets. The strange child's clothing did not match the others. The cut of the fabric was outdated, belonging to a style nearly 20 years older than 1903. Worse still, the shoes, worn, scuffed, and caked in mud, were not school attire at all. They looked like the shoes of someone buried and unearthed. And then there was the expression. Every other child in the photo wore the same blank, stiff mask typical of old photos, eyes forward, mouths closed. But the forgotten child's face seemed different. The corners of the lips curled, almost a smile. The eyes, though blurred, gave an impression of awareness, as though this figure was not frozen in time like the others, but watching, present, alive in some sinister way. Creepy storytelling spread around these details. Some said if you looked long enough, the faint smile widened, changing subtly from one viewing to the next. Others swore the eyes darkened over time, becoming hollow pits. Whether these were tricks of the mind or the work of something darker, no one could say. By the 1970s, paranormal investigators had begun to use the photograph in their research. One team placed the image under infrared light, claiming shapes appeared in the background, shadows resembling hands reaching toward the rows of children. Another experiment involved exposing the photograph to long periods of white light. The investigators swore they heard faint whispers as the photo developed again. A single word repeated, "Stay." Digital technology in the 1990s only deepened the mystery. Scans revealed layers of texture that should not exist. The pale child's outline was sharper than the rest, as if the figure had been added after the photo was taken. Yet chemical tests proved the image was original, unaltered since 1903. And then came the most disturbing discovery. When the photograph was digitally restored, experts noticed a faint reflection in the glassy eyes of the forgotten child. Zooming in, pixel by pixel, they claimed to see what looked like the silhouette of the schoolhouse windows. But in that reflection, another figure appeared. Tall, thin, standing behind the photographer. If true, this would mean the extra child was not the only presence captured that day. The photograph, once thought to hold only a single anomaly, now seemed to contain layers of hidden truth. Every detail pulled the viewer deeper into the darkness. The outdated clothing, the unnatural smile, the impossible reflection. Each clue a fragment of a sinister past, a piece of eerie evidence pointing towards something that should not exist. People who viewed the restored image reported disturbing reactions. Nausea, migraines, sudden chills. Some even claimed they dreamed of the forgotten child the night after seeing it. Dreams where the figure stepped forward, out of the rows, closer and closer, until it stood at the foot of their bed. Theories multiplied. Was this post-mortem photography, a corpse posed among the living? Was it a vanished child, erased from memory, but captured forever in silver nitrate? Or was it something far stranger, a presence that had forced itself into the photograph, using the camera as a doorway? The photograph was no longer just a relic of 1903. It was an active mystery, a disturbing image that demanded attention, that consumed those who studied it. The more it was re-examined, the less it felt like a picture of the past, and the more it felt like a warning for the present. One photograph, one forgotten child, one reflection that suggested something more. And with each new discovery, the shadows around the story only grew darker. The photograph had been examined, studied, magnified, and debated for nearly a century. But instead of answers, it produced only more questions. And where history leaves silence, legend rushes in to fill the void. The townsfolk, the historians, the skeptics, and the believers all had their theories. Some logical, some terrifying, and some that should never have been spoken at all. The first theory was the most familiar, that the pale child was simply a trick of photography, a blur caused by movement, a flaw in the old glass plate. It was the explanation skeptics clung to, desperate to pull the photograph back into the realm of the ordinary, but even they struggled with its precision. The forgotten figure wasn't a smudge or a streak of light. It was clear, deliberate, placed exactly in the row with the others. It had weight. It had form. And it seemed intentional. The second theory turned darker. Whispers of post-mortem photography echoed through the town's memory. Could the child have been dead even as the shutter clicked? Victorians had been known to prop corpses upright, painting their cheeks to mimic life. Had one family brought their departed child to the class photo, desperate for inclusion, only to bury their identity forever? If so, why deny it later? Why erase the name? And why did no record of death remain? Others leaned toward folklore. They said the child was a spirit, an echo of one buried behind the schoolhouse, forever bound to the land. The stories spoke of epidemics, of graves without markers, of children who vanished during harsh winters. Perhaps the photograph captured one of them, stepping out of shadow for a single moment, refusing to be lost in time. But then came the more sinister theories. Ones whispered in corners, spoken only in fear. Some claimed the figure was not human at all, that the thing in the photograph wore the shape of a child, but it was a mask, a lure, something that attached itself to the school, feeding on the presence of the young, hiding in plain sight. Theories like these spoke of haunted places, of creatures from forbidden language and rituals long forgotten, things that blurred the line between superstition and horror storytelling. One chilling detail gave this theory weight. The photograph was not the only appearance. Scattered reports suggested the same pale figure appeared in other disturbing images from the region. A family portrait from 1897 with an unfamiliar child standing at the edge. A church group in 1909 with one face blurred beyond recognition. If true, this meant the presence was not tied to a single class, but to the town itself, a shadow that wandered through time, showing itself when the camera lens was open. Fear spread with every retelling. Parents warned their children not to linger near the woods behind the school. Travelers passed through but did not stay long. The locals grew wary of outsiders asking questions, as though digging too deep might awaken the very thing they feared. By the late 20th century, the photograph had taken on the weight of legend. It became a story told in hushed tones, a tale to frighten children into obedience. Behave, or the forgotten child will come for you. And like all legends, it twisted into countless forms, some claiming the child was a lost soul, others insisting it was a demon in disguise, and still more believing it was the land itself, demanding sacrifice. Yet among these theories, one truth remained constant. No one could explain the extra face. Not the teachers, not the records, not the scientists or the skeptics. And that gap, that silence, was what gave the story its enduring power. Because the unknown is always more terrifying than the known. In the end, the photograph became more than an image. It became a mirror. Those who looked at it saw what they most feared: death, erasure, haunting, deception. Some saw tragedy. Some saw evil. But all saw something they could not explain. And the more the photograph was studied, the more one disturbing possibility lingered. What if the forgotten child was never meant to be identified? What if the absence of a name was not a gap in history, but the very essence of the mystery itself? One photograph, one figure that should not exist, one legend that grew darker with every telling, and fear. Fear that the child in the photograph was still waiting to be remembered. The year was 1903, and it gave us more than a class photograph. It gave us a mystery that refuses to die. We have walked through the forgotten town, the abandoned school, and the whispers of those who lived and died there. We have stared into the faded photograph, searching for a truth that always slips through our fingers. And though more than a century has passed, one fact remains unchanged. There is a child in the image who does not belong, and no one remembers their name. History gave us records. The town gave us silence, and the photograph gave us a face, cold, pale, and eternal. Some claim it was simply an error. Others swear it was a child lost to disease, preserved through post-mortem photography and placed among the living. Still more believe it was never human at all, but something that wore the form of innocence to draw us closer. And so the photograph has become more than a relic. It has become a haunting reminder of how easily the past slips into shadow. A reminder that not every child was remembered. Not every story was told. Some were buried, erased, or swallowed by time. but look closely at the image once more. The other children are captured in rigid poses, frozen as the shutter locks their faces in place. Yet the forgotten child seems different. The expression too soft. The eyes too hollow. A figure caught not in stillness, but in silence, like a whisper that lingers after all others have gone. Dark history leaves scars. And this photograph is one of them. It speaks of vanished children, of haunted places, of eerie families who carried secrets they could never share. It speaks of forbidden language whispered in the dark, of rituals lost to time, of unsettling history that clings to the edges of memory. And though skeptics will argue, the truth remains unshaken. No document, no diary, no census ever recorded the child who stares back at us. A presence caught in ink and paper, but absent from every trace of life. That silence is what chills us most. Because silence leaves space for imagination, and imagination fills it with fear. Now, more than a century later, the photograph survives. It circulates online. It hangs in dusty archives. And every time it resurfaces, new eyes find themselves asking the same question. Who was that child? But perhaps the better question is, what was that child? Because sometimes, photographs do not capture memories. Sometimes, they capture something else entirely, something we were never meant to see. Something that exists only on the edge of our perception, waiting to be noticed. The class photo of 1903 was supposed to preserve innocence, friendship, and childhood. Instead, it preserved fear. A fear that outlives the children, the teachers, even the town itself. And that is the true horror. Not the missing records, not the blurred outlines, but the idea that the forgotten child has never left the photograph at all, that they are still there, waiting, watching, locked in time, but reaching into ours. So the next time you glance at an old photograph, look carefully at the faces, count them, study their eyes, and ask yourself, do you recognize every single person? Or is there someone there who doesn't belong? Someone the others have chosen not to remember? The forgotten child stares out from 1903, but perhaps in some corner of another photograph. They are staring at you. This story ends where the photograph begins, with silence. The silence of a name never spoken, the silence of a child never claimed, and the silence of history that refuses to answer. But the photograph remains, a haunting image, a reminder that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, and that some faces, once seen, can never be forgotten, even if they were never remembered.